Hi Kavita, I welcome you and the audience on behalf of the KLF on this interesting session on the discussion with Kavita Puri on her stupendous work, Partition Voices, Untold British Stories. Kavita has already been introduced to you, so I think to allot time for the audience later, I would get directly to the book. We all in India, we all have at least theoretically heard of partition, though the south of India hasn't been very much affected by it. But we have learnt it as part of our history, as a part of the struggle for freedom movement, which simultaneously the history of freedom entailed some mention about the partition also. In mid-August 1947, it wasn't just one nation that attained independence. There were two nations simultaneously celebrating independence. But of course, it was not all about celebration. It entailed it entailed a partition, an unprecedented, although it was, maybe it was in the air that a partition may come about, but the way it came, the suddenness of it, and the great large-scale dislocation that it entailed across the newly built border between India and Pakistan. That has, of course, that entailed a lot of violence and horrific incidents on the one hand, and also spontaneous acts of kindness from unexpected quarters on the other hand. Kavita Puri's book, Partition Voices, is very significant in that it brings before us the scenes which happened almost 8 decades ago from the mouths of those people who were in the middle of it all, who were in it, who were part of it, and who have retained the memories of that, those absolutely unforgettable memories which have been etched in their mind and which they have not spoken for many years, many decades rather. And then ultimately some of them chose to speak up. Kavita's book is especially very important because it gives us a testimony of a very quickly dwindling population, people who are in their mid-70s, ranging between septuagenarian and nonagenarians. And in fact, even as this book came out, many of the interviewees whom Kavita just managed to kind of record their testimony, they are not amidst us anymore. Of course, we have come across many other books on partition. Many of us would have read Khushwant Singh's and Urvashi Butalia and many others. Even Kavita also extensively cites a lot of books. But what makes Kavita's book very unique is it gives us the testimony of those people who lived the experience. And not only they were uprooted from their soil once. They had to go across borders, either from India or from Pakistan. They had to move. They had to leave their soil, the soil where they were born and they grew up, and much loss ensued. Not only that, but eventually they migrated further. They migrated towards Britain for various reasons, which Kavita underlies in many ways, some for better prospects and mainly many to rebuild the nation there. The erstwhile Raj, post-war situation, they had to rebuild the nation. And for many reasons, they In fact, at that time, until 1962, it was, in fact, Britain was an extension of the empire only, I believe, from what I've read of this. And and this actually tells us what it meant to those, what this entire saga of partition and what it entailed, and the untold sufferings which it caused, what it meant for the people of that generation and the subsequent generations who grew up in Britain. And I'm sure we have a lot of, we have a leaf, in the end we'll have some takeaway from the experiences as told from the experience of Kavita as well as her friends and compatriots in Britain. So, Kavita, can you briefly explain what prompted you to embark on this, in fact, daunting experience, I should say, of interviewing people in their, who are really in the fag end of their lives, to recount what they have been silent about for so long, and then what it meant to them and to the subsequent generations, and your father also having been, of course, you can speak only just as much as you want to, but about what you want to say. But can you explain how this interviews, what impact it had on you, and what did you expect and what came out of it?
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. So I, in about 2017, which was the year of the 70th anniversary of the partition of India, was very aware that that event, a momentous event of the 20th century, was slipping away in terms of the lived experience. And even the word partition is not a subject, is not a word that is well known in Britain. People don't know what that means. We don't really talk much about empire. And back then, even now, it's not a subject that is part of our national curriculum, incredibly. And so I embarked upon a journey of collecting the testimonies of people within Britain who had lived through the partition of India. And as we've heard, that it's probably worth saying the partition, the statistics involved are overwhelming. You had 10 to 12 million people around the time of partition who were on the move. At the time, it was the largest mass migration outside war and famine the world had ever seen. Around 1 million people estimated are believed to have died. 75,000 women raped, abducted, forced to convert to the other religion. And I think that when you talk about an event in terms of statistics, it doesn't mean anything. And so I was trying to get behind those statistics and see if I could find people who could tell me about that time. And so I persuaded someone at the BBC to commission me to do a program about it, and I had no idea what I would find, if people would be ready to talk, if there were people in our country who could. And what I quickly realized, because we put call-outs on the radio and we talked to faith leaders and we kind of talked to people in the community, what I realized was that the stories of partition are all around us in Britain. That if you speak to somebody who has South Asian descent in Britain, and by the way, there's a lot of us now, we're the largest ethnic minority group in Britain. We've even had a prime minister of South Asian origin.
And you're all categorized as South Asian as such?
Yes,
that's Indian.
Exactly, that's a whole other thing. Yeah. But if you speak to someone of South Asian origin, they will directly or indirectly have a partition story. A bit like if you speak to somebody who has European Jewish ancestry, they will have a direct or indirect connection to the Holocaust. And so I managed to collect these stories of people who, if it's 70 years on, it's a long time. I mean, I think the youngest person I spoke to was 6 at the time, so then he was 76. They were talking towards the end of their lives, and these are people who you know, they had found it very, very difficult to talk about, and they had rarely talked to people in their own family. Their own family members may not have known their stories. It was, as I said, there was definitely no public discussion of it. There was no public space to talk about these kinds of stories of trauma and violence, but also nostalgia for the place that you've left. And so in that 70th anniversary, not just my radio series, but there was a really significant television program, people began to start talking, but also people began to start asking. People who were second, third generation wanted to know their stories. And this wasn't just within South Asian families. British people were shocked, surprised to hear about this bloody, horrific, catastrophic, ill-thought-through end to empire. They didn't know that story too, and they wanted to know. And so I think it's probably the 7 odd years since the book came out, things have slowly started to change in Britain, and that is a good thing. You're right, it's part of my own family story too. My father lived through partition. He never talked about it. He talked about it to me towards the end of his days, which I think is quite a common thing. I think that people towards the end of their life realize if I don't speak now, those stories will never be told. And so I was so lucky that at a particular moment, because I spoke to historians who tried to do something similar during the 50th and 60th anniversaries, and people weren't ready to speak. We're going to have an 80th anniversary, and sadly, it's too late now. And I was so lucky that when I embarked upon this, it was a tiny window, the tiniest of windows, and that I could record these really remarkable and varied, surprising and very moving testimonies.
So I think the book actually brings out the untold agony and the trauma of being uprooted from your own soil and losing all that you thought was your own. Some lost their friends, and friends and family. And I think, Kavita, what traumatized most people seems to be the suddenness of the partition. Like they weren't exactly prepared, or they thought that they aren't going to be affected by it.
So I think, it's probably worth saying very briefly, because the kind of, it was a very complex run-up to the decision to partition. But partition, well, the transfer of power from British India to India, another country, was due to take place in June 1948. But Mountbatten decided in June 1947 that partition and independence should take place in 10 weeks. 10 weeks to divide a nation as complex as India. And the 2 districts that would be dissected were the most populous places where people lived in very mixed communities side by side. The unpicking of these communities was a virtually impossible task. And so people had 10 weeks. They knew that this thing, partition and independence, was going to come. They had no idea where the line would be. But nobody thought, the British, nor the new colonial, nor the new authorities in India and Pakistan, nobody thought that people would move. They thought they would stay. And in a way, why shouldn't they? They had lived on that land for many, many generations. But what happened was, in the lead up, in the months to partition and the decision of where this line would be drawn, in Punjab, which was, remember, one of those places that was going to be divided, there was huge bloodshed, killing, violence against the other being people of the other religion, because the 2 states were predicated along religious lines, essentially. Some people moved in anticipation of where the line would be. And incredibly, at the great moments of independence on the 14th and 15th of August, the line had not been announced. It wasn't announced till 2 days later. So when those celebrations were happening, people had no idea where they were going to be in which country. And so when the decision of the British of where things were going to be apportioned was announced, of course not everybody moved. Some people did. Some people realize I'm now a minority in a new country. Some people said, I will stay. This is my land. Why should I leave? And so what happened over the days and weeks that ensued was even the people who stayed, it became too dangerous, and they would hear, for those that moved suddenly, they would hear that there was a disturbance nearby and they needed to move and move very quickly, and so they would just take whatever they could. But they didn't think they'd have to leave forever, so often they would leave a key to a house with a neighbour, they'd bury their jewellery in the ground, they'd leave enough food for the animals to eat, but they would leave in haste. Literally nobody that I spoke to ever went back. And when I mean ever went back to live, I mean ever went back even to see the home that they had left. And so people moved in a rush, and they went in those kind of long caravans of people that could be miles long. Probably at the time, if you could take pictures from space, you would be able to see those lines of humanity walking with whatever they could. And they've been immortalized in those very famous Margaret Bourke-White images that she took for Life magazine at the time. Other people took trains, which were particularly treacherous because it was obvious whichever way you were going would declare what religion you were. And so people were massacred. Entire trainloads of people were massacred, but the one person who wasn't massacred was the train driver, so that he could bring the train into the station. And if you were lucky and you were fortunate and you were privileged, you could take a plane. But everybody left in haste. If you could prepare in time, you might take a few things. But you were leaving your home, you were leaving your job, you were leaving your education, and you were never coming back. So people were starting their lives from scratch again in a new country. And sometimes you were having to learn an entirely new language. If you were leaving from Karachi to go to Mumbai, which is what many Sindhis did by boat, you had to then learn a whole new language, Marathi. And so for all these people that found themselves in this new country, often living in homes that had been vacated by people of the other religion, you never really felt like that was your home, and that this place that was your home was somewhere across the border in this other place. And so the memories that I was excavating 70 years on, of course they were memories of trauma and violence, which is what I expected. But what I hadn't expected were these stories of longing for a place that had existed mostly in their minds. And so many people said, I hope I can go back one day to see the place that I left, my home, my childhood friend that I had no time to say goodbye to, that tree I used to play in. Does my house still exist? And they all want to see their home before they die, but mostly, nearly all of them will sadly never do that. And for those lucky enough to go back, and some people have made the trek, and by the way, it's much easier to travel to the place that you had to leave if you're coming from Britain, because it's virtually impossible now if you're Pakistani to go to India and vice versa. They'll take a stone or they'll take the earth. And in fireplaces across Britain, you'll see these little tiny remnants of a place that once was theirs, and that's all that they have as proof to say, we were there once too.
In fact, I think even as they were leaving, they never thought that they were never going to come back.
Yeah.
And most of them in both sides of the border, like the Hindus leaving India, that's so newly formed India, across border, they left their house keys to their Muslim neighbors. And the same happened on the other side. The Muslim neighbors were entrusting their family and their possessions to the Hindu neighbors. And they were really, spontaneous acts of kindness, people protecting each other. And I think what they ultimately retain in their mind, what they cherished most was a very peaceful coexistence where the difference in religion didn't matter. It was a shared experience of life. They grew up together on the same soil. In fact, I was very touched by one person who said, between soil and religion, soil is superior. The land, they still speak of their land. They have come far from it. They have been uprooted, but they think of their birthplace as their land, their soil, and they're carrying a handful of soil to wherever they belong from that place if they chance to come back. So that pull is still there, and I think across generations, that's what they wish to carry forward. The goodness, the kindness, the innate humanity. Despite all this violence, there are many people are keeping faith in that and have a very yearning to go back to that time.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that the thing that is passed on in generations, and people didn't talk about it. People didn't talk about it in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh as well. But even in silence, trauma can be transmitted, and I think that stories, contradictory things, have been passed on. Of course, there is fear of sometimes the other. The stories of trauma, of the violence are carried on. But at the same time, that feeling of nostalgia, the sense that you are from another place, can also exist. And I think it's very significant what people 70 years on want remembered tell you, because they could have told me very different stories. But for every single story of horror I was told told a story of people transcending hatred to help the other, be it a neighbor who warned of, that the girls are going to be taken that day, or people who did good things to make sure not only neighbors but strangers were saved. And I think that is really significant too, especially when, particularly on the Indian subcontinent, national narratives might tell you very different things. And the stories that the partition survivors tell you really counter the national narratives, that coexistence between religions is possible.
I think we'll give about 3 minutes time for the audience if they want. From the audience, like both Kavita and I can go on talking about the book, but if there is, you have any queries, please.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Kevin Kelly and I'm the Irish ambassador. So really interested in meeting you, and I've been following, of course, your wonderful BBC Radio 4 series. And you haven't mentioned it, but you tell stories that are very similar to our history. The story that you told through 3 Million in terms of the Bengal famine, and our own famine that happened during the colonial period, where 1 million people died and 1 million people emigrated. Also, the work you're doing on partition is also very, very important, because, of course, very close to where you live as a British person, there's a big partition on the island of Ireland that still poses challenges. So I'm just interested to know a couple of things. Have you thought any kind of parallels between looking at Irish colonial history and the Indian experience? It'd be interesting to know whether you've thought about that. And you also made a very important point, I think, that in Britain, the history they learn is very different to the history we learn in Ireland. And sometimes there bears no resemblance. So you're doing a very important job. I just wanted to acknowledge that because the work that you do telling these stories is not just about producing a book or a radio series. It's actually about future generations and future reconciliation and legacy. So I want to congratulate you for that. But do you think that things are changing in Britain? Are people more willing to face their history? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think about Ireland a lot. Because when this series came out and the work on the famine, so many people with Irish ancestry were in touch with me to say that's our story too. And I think there are so many parallels in the way that the British dealt with India and Ireland in both cases, but also in the way that Britain remembers both colonial history or doesn't remember it. And I would say it's the same for both. Because if we don't remember the British partition or our famine, we certainly don't remember the Irish too. And I think that for some reason, and maybe it's 80 years on now from partition and the famine. It's far longer than for the Irish examples. We should be able to talk about these things. A grown-up country can talk about these things, can talk about our past. And certainly now when, there's no one alive who took the decisions that were made concerning Ireland or India, British India. But the one thing that we can do, is to remember. And we're not doing that because it is not part of the national curriculum, I should say, in England. Wales has a different curriculum and they are trying to do better. But we should know our own history. And I think we have to be able to do that without blame. I also think, how on earth can we explain why there are so many South Asians in Britain if we don't understand the story of empire and we don't understand the story of partition? Because the early migrants who came in the 1950s and the post-war years were people who had suffered from partition. If you've lost everything once, it makes total sense that you would uproot again because the worst things already happened. Why wouldn't you start a new life? And so Britain needs to understand this history, Irish history, because it is British history. It is British history. That is not controversial to say. And, we're in Britain, we are living through, or have lived through, and I don't know how it's going to turn out, this kind of culture war, and history has been at the front. But I would say, and what gives me such hope, is that when I speak to people at events like this around Britain, younger people or at schools, they want to know. And they want to know without any of the heaviness that other generations have had. And so I think things will change because those people will be in charge one day and our history will be remembered and honoured.
So I think we are not able to take any more questions. But as Kavita pointed out, it's a shared history between Britain, Pakistan, and India. And though the experience of partition may not be the same in all these places, I think each one must have felt this other, being othered in a different place, being uprooted from their own land and going elsewhere and starting right from the scratch. And it's a very poignant tale, but what is amazing is that nearly everybody who have given their testimony have built up their life from the scratch and actually emerged very successful in their different areas or the chosen field, and in Britain also and everywhere. So after reading this, there are many points in this book which will really make you break into tears. I mean, you can't help it. It's so touching. I mean, I cannot do justice in a half an hour discussion to the book. It's meant to be read. And the main takeaway I feel is hope. Like after when somebody can overcome what they went through during the partition time and the aftermath and be successful in life, there is no suffering in which is worth the name in life, and anybody can rise in their lives. I think that is that is what I feel we have to take away from this, very precious documentation of people who are going away from our midst very soon. So I think it's a must read.
The red light's flashing.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you.